what are the priorities of the new president? I've touched on a few of them, but let me just try to sort of sum up with a few broad thoughts, and then we'll have a chance for discussion. One is that the new president is going to continue to deal with this mortgage financial crisis for at least the first couple of years of his term. This is not going to end quickly. When the new president takes over, and for many months, many quarters, and perhaps several years into his administration, the economy is likely to be relatively weak, with relatively high unemployment, with a low savings rate, and this continued overhang in the housing market. This is not going to go away quickly. So whatever the president wanted to do, he's going to be saddled with this very difficult circumstance. And then he's going to have the management problem of how do you unwind this? What is the right moment to decide whether the government wants to privatize Fannie and Freddie or not? Does the government want to take it over completely? Does it want to privatize it? Does it want to privatize parts of it? Does it want to privatize the whole thing? These are enormous decisions. How long does the Treasury continue to buy up the kind of assets that it's going to be buying up under the Paulson plan? When does it decide it wants to sell them? Is there going to be a time in the next 3 or 4 years when it should sell them? At what price? How do you go about selling them in the market? That's going to be a very complicated, very politically difficult decision to have to make. These kinds of challenges, when the government becomes involved in the economy, the challenges not just to becoming involved, but how do you unwind this level of involvement is going to be extremely important. The third thing is going to have to be a much more effective prioritization of the use of public money over the course of the next several years. I think it's fair to say, and part of the reason I wrote the book was to describe this point. This is the first war in history that we've paid for entirely by borrowing. In every other major war in our history, we've increased taxes to help pay for the war, and we have cut non-essential domestic programs to make room in the budget to pay for the war. Now, one can understand, and some people will disagree and some won't, but you can have made the argument that in 2001 and 2003 it was not a good idea to raise taxes, that you could perhaps say you needed to lower taxes. That's a plausible argument. But what's not a plausible argument is that while you're lowering taxes, you also turn the taps on with large amounts of spending for non-essential purposes. If you look at the highway bill, you look at the agriculture bill, you could have, and not just those, but there are several others, where you could have spent a lot less money than was done. And therefore, we've seen, as I say, when you add up the tax cuts and the additional spending that went on for non-security purposes, we've borrowed the entire cost of the war. But it's not just the war, and the war is a lot of money, but the budget deficit's been going up for a variety of other reasons as well, even before the current downturn. And that is, we have not had a very rigorous process of prioritization of our financial requirements in Washington. We figured that we could spend a lot of money and that these big budget deficits wouldn't catch up with us. Well, the problem is going to be not so much now, although the deficit's going to be large now, but in the out years, in the future years, in the coming decade, when you add Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and the additional interest that will have to be paid on a rise in federal debt, this is going to be an enormous burden. This is going to make the deficits that we have today and the debt accumulation that we're now experiencing look small in comparison. And there has to be a way of addressing this. And from my point of view, this is going to be an increasingly important political issue. Peter and I were talking a little bit earlier about perhaps the current crisis may make people more aware of the fact that we cannot build up these huge debts over the next couple of decades, that perhaps now when people realize that we have to come to grips with these problems in advance before they get to the point of a crisis, maybe we'll have a more serious debate on Social Security and Medicare. It's possible that we will have learned the lessons that if you put off dealing with problems, they can lead to a crisis. If you deal with them early on and try to anticipate them and try to make the kind of changes you need in advance, then perhaps the country will avoid the fact that if we don't deal with these problems, we're going to have a huge increase in debt. There's going to be more squeeze on the regular part of the federal budget deficit, including perhaps some very essential parts of it, and there'll be a lot of pressure to raise taxes for our children and our grandchildren, the next generation of taxpayers. The international issues that the President is going to have to address are going to be even more complicated than those we've had to deal with. And I haven't mentioned the military parts of the Iraq War, but I will mention another element that is going to change a lot, and that is America's influence over the world from a financial point of view. If you go back to former financial crises in the past, the United States has been the go-to country. If you had to take the Mexican crisis, but you could take many others as well. If you got into financial trouble, you came to Washington. Either you came to the IMF, or you came to the Treasury, or you came to both in order to get money. Now, the role of the IMF has been dramatically diminished. The United States does not have a lot of money to spend in helping countries like the East Asians or the Mexicans or anyone else at this point. We're already incurring a lot of debt dealing with our own problems. But there are a lot of countries that have sovereign wealth funds that do have money. And I was talking to the finance minister of a Latin American country, not Venezuela, a smaller country in Latin America, that said, and I was talking to him, I said, well, you have a financial problem, and several of them do. He said, we do, but you know there's a big difference now, and that is, we don't have to come to the Treasury and the IMF to get their loans with their traditional conditions. We're going to, all we have to do is call Caracas or Beijing or Dubai or Riyadh or Moscow, and we can get plenty of money because they've got plenty of money. I said, the problem is, you don't think there are any strings on that money? He said, yes, there are strings, but they're not the same strings. They're not the same as the IMF. They don't come from Washington. These are different kinds of strings. So I think that's one of the big differences. The ability of the United States to influence the global financial system is going to be much more limited in the future than it was in the past. And the same thing is on the trading side. We cannot deal, as in the past there was a tradition that the United States, Western Europe, and to a degree Japan could work out trade deals. And once the US and the EU agreed, then most other countries would fall in line. Not all of them, but most of them. Now that is not true, and we've seen that in the failure of the last talks of the Doha round. It was the Indias and the Chinas and others that had a lot of influence, and when they decided they would not go along with the United States for a variety of complicated reasons that Pascal will, I'm sure, go along with, we'll describe later when he has the opportunity to speak here, the fact is that we cannot influence the trading system to the degree we did before. We are still the most important country in the financial system. We're still the most important country in the trading system. But our degree of influence, our degree of leverage, our degree of ability to reward and to punish both has dramatically declined, in part as a result of the current crisis, but even before that, it was a result of the fact that other countries now have more financial power and more trading power and are working more closely together than they did in the past. And the last point that I'll conclude on is that the structure of the global economy is going to have to change in a number of ways, whether it's through new institutions or revitalizing and renovating the current ones. If you go back, most of the institutions that we have today were products of World War II or the immediate post-World War II period. The World Bank, the IMF, WTO, which is the success organization of the GATT, NATO, a lot of these institutions, and they were remarkably effective institutions across the board, remarkably effective.